The heavy, iron-scented air of the obsidian throne room pressed against Elara Bourne's lungs, every breath a gamble against the silence. She was pressed so tightly into the velvet shadows of the clerestory gallery that the stone masonry bit into her spine, but she didn't dare shift. Below her the impossible was happening. The Great Mating, a ritual whispered about in human border towns as a death sentence for any witness, was unfolding in a sea of monochrome silk and predatory grace. The floor was a mosaic of polished onyx, reflecting the flickering violet flames of 1,000 enchanted torches. This wasn't just a ceremony, it was a pulse, a vibration of ancient, lethal power that made Elara's human heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. Before I go any further into this night of shadows and secrets, hello to all of you incredible souls tuning in. I am so thrilled to have you here in our storytelling circle. Whether you are watching from the misty highlands, a bustling city, or the quiet comfort of your home, I want to know, where are you joining us from today? Drop your location in the comments. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and join our community. Your support is the heartbeat of this channel, and I promise you today's journey is one you will never forget. Are you subscribed? Good. Now let's descend back into the darkness. Elara's fingers, cold and trembling, gripped the edge of the stone railing. She shouldn't be here. A weaver's daughter from the fringe colonies had no business peering into the sanctum of the vampire king, Kalen Kovacs. But curiosity had always been her curse, a fire that burned hotter than the fear of the fangs that ruled her world. She watched, mesmerized, as the noble-born vampires, women of ethereal, terrifying beauty, lined the promenade, their skin like buffed marble under the violet light. They were waiting for the choice. They were waiting for the king to claim the bloodline that would anchor his reign for the next century. The atmosphere was thick with a cloying, sweet incense that failed to mask the sharp, metallic tang of pheromones and ancient magic. Then the heavy doors at the far end of the hall groaned open. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a forest when a predator enters the clearing. Kalen Kovacs moved with a terrifying liquid lethality. He didn't wear a crown, he didn't need one. His presence was an atmospheric pressure that seemed to dim the very torches. His hair was the color of midnight, his eyes a piercing, frozen silver that looked as though they had seen civilizations crumble and felt nothing. As he stepped toward the center of the hall, the noble women bowed in a synchronized wave of silk, their necks bared in a gesture of total submission. Elara felt a bead of sweat roll down her temple. She was a ghost in the rafters, a speck of dust in the grand design of the immortals. The ritual began, a low rhythmic chanting in a language that sounded like grinding stones and rushing water. The high priest stepped forward, holding a chalice of ceremonial vitae, the liquid shimmering with a dark inner light. This was the moment. The king would drink, his senses would heighten to a supernatural peak, and he would scent the one destined to stand by his side. Elara held her breath, her eyes wide, capturing every forbidden detail. She saw Kalen take the chalice. She saw his throat move as he swallowed the potent draught. And then the world stopped. The chanting died mid-syllable. The high priest froze. The king didn't turn toward the line of beautiful, expectant brides. Instead, his head snapped upward. Those silver eyes, now bleeding into a predatory crimson at the edges, locked onto the exact shadow where Elara crouched. The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it vanished. Elara's heart skipped a beat, then two. He wasn't looking near her. He was looking at her. Through the dark, through the stone, through the very fabric of her concealment. "Halt," the king commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an avalanche. The royal court gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a hiss. Kalen dropped the chalice. It shattered on the onyx floor, the red liquid spreading like a blooming rose of ill omen. He didn't spare a glance for his court. He began to walk. Not toward the throne and not toward his suitors. He walked toward the spiraling stone stairs that led to the forbidden galleries. Elara backed away, her boots scuffing the stone, a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the vacuum of the hall. She turned to flee, but the shadows themselves seemed to thicken, pinning her in place. She reached the door she had sneaked through, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the steady, rhythmic click of boots on stone grew closer. Thud, thud, thud. Each one sounded like a nail being driven into her coffin. She spun around, her back hitting the locked door, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. The king rounded the corner of the gallery. He was tall, looming over her, a god of death draped in charcoal velvet. The scent of him hit her, rainwater, cedar, and something dangerously electric. He stopped 5 feet away, his chest heaving slightly, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of her terror, and something else. Something that made his pupils dilate until his eyes were nothing but bottomless black voids. The entire kingdom waited below in confused silence, but here in the dim light of the high gallery, the world had narrowed down to a predator and his impossible prey. Kalen leaned in, his voice a low vibrating growl that rattled Alara's very bones. "How is it," he whispered, "that I have spent 400 years searching for a scent that didn't exist, only to find it hiding in the dust of my own ceiling?" Alara could only stare, her voice trapped in her throat. The mating occasion was over. The hunt had begun. But as his hand reached out, not to strike but to ghost a finger along her jawline, the question wasn't just how she would survive. The question was, why was the vampire king looking at a human peasant as if she were the only thing in the universe that mattered? The silence in the gallery was heavy, vibrating with the sudden, sharp intensity of Kalen's focus. Alara pressed her palms against the rough stone of the door behind her, her breath hitching as his shadow swallowed her whole. Up close, the vampire king wasn't just a figure of legend, he was a force of nature. His skin was pale, yes, but it lacked the sickly translucence of the lesser nobles below. It looked like fine porcelain over steel. I wasn't trying to steal anything," Alara managed to whisper, her voice cracking. It was a pathetic defense, but the truth was even more dangerous. How could she explain that she was a girl who had grown up in the gray silence of the fringe, where the only color came from the vivid, terrifying stories her grandmother told? Alara wasn't just a weaver's daughter. In the colony of Oakhaven, she was the girl who looked at the horizon too long. While the others kept their heads down, weaving the heavy black funeral shrouds that were the town's only export to the vampire citadels, Alara had spent her nights studying the stars and the forbidden maps hidden in the floorboards of her father's workshop. She was driven by a hunger that food couldn't satisfy, a need to know if the world was truly as small and dark as the high walls of her village suggested. Her father, Silas Bourne, had always warned her. "The shadows have teeth, Alara. Don't go looking for the light in a place made of darkness." But Silas was a man broken by the tithe, his hands gnarled from years of labor, his spirit dimmed by the loss of Alara's mother to a fever that everyone knew was actually a predator's whim. Alara didn't want to fade away like him. She wanted to see the truth even if it killed her. And tonight it very well might. Kalen Kovacs didn't move. He stood so still he might have been a statue, but his eyes, those haunting silver-rimmed depths, were searching her face with a desperation that didn't match his lethal reputation. For 400 years, Kalen had sat upon the obsidian throne, a king of a dying race. The vampires were fading, the ancient blood was thinning, and the mating occasion was less a celebration and more a frantic attempt to find a compatible soul to tether their waning magic. Kalen hated the ritual. He hated the perfumed noblewomen who looked at him with ambition instead of affection. He lived in a world of political maneuvers and blood debts, surrounded by advisors like Lord Cashin, a man whose loyalty was as sharp and treacherous as a glass blade. Kalen was lonely in a way that only an immortal could be, carrying the weight of a kingdom that expected him to be a monster, while he secretly craved a connection that didn't require a contract. "You are human," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a register that sent a shiver straight down Alara's spine. It wasn't a question. "Your blood, it sings. I could hear your heartbeat from the throne." It was the only honest sound in that entire hall. He reached out, his cold fingers finally brushing the pulse point at her neck. Alara gasped, her eyes fluttering shut. The contact was electric. It wasn't the coldness of death. It was the chill of a winter wind that promised a change in the seasons. For a moment the fear receded, replaced by a strange, magnetic pull. She saw a flicker of something in his mind, a flash of a sun-drenched field, a memory so old it was crumbling at the edges. "What are you?" he breathed, leaning closer until his lips were inches from her ear. "Just Alara," she whispered, finding a spark of her usual defiance. A girl who wanted to see if the king was as heartless as the stories say. Below them, the doors to the gallery burst open. Lord Cashin stood there, flanked by the royal guard, their swords drawn and glowing with runic light. "Pi King!" Cashin shouted, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the human girl. "An intruder? In the sacred gallery during the choice? This is a desecration. Step away and we will dispose of the vermin immediately." Kalen didn't turn around. He didn't even flinch. His hand moved from Alara's neck to her waist, pulling her flush against his cold, hard chest in a gesture that was shockingly protective. "She is not vermin, Cashin," Kalen said, his voice turning into a lethal edge of ice. "And she is not an intruder." He turned then, shielding Alara with his cloak, his eyes flashing a violent, glowing crimson that made even the guards recoil. "She is the reason I stopped the ceremony. She is the choice." The shock that rippled through the gallery was palpable. A human? The queen of the obsidian throne? It was madness. It was treason against their very nature. But as Alara looked up at the profile of the man holding her, the monster who was currently defying his entire race for a weaver's daughter, she realized that her curiosity had led her into a storm she could never escape. And for the first time in her life she didn't want to run. The proclamation hung in the frigid air of the gallery like a death sentence. Lord Cashin's face, usually a mask of aristocratic boredom, contorted into something jagged and ugly. "A human," he spat, the word vibrating with a centuries-old prejudice. "My king, the madness of the bloodthirst must finally be taking you. To claim a breeder from the colonies as the mate of the obsidian throne? The High Council will have your head before the sun rises." Kalen didn't flinch. He tightened his grip on Alara's waist, his thumb grazing the thin fabric of her tunic. The heat of her body was a localized sun in his world of permafrost. "The High Council serves the throne, Cashin. And the throne has spoken." Alara felt the world tilting. She was a weaver, a shadow dweller, a girl who spent her days untangling knots in wool, not the political knots of an immortal empire. "Kalen," she whispered, the use of his name drawing a sharp, hissed intake of breath from the guards. "I don't belong here. You're starting a war for a girl who can barely afford her own bread." He looked down at her, and for a fleeting second the terrifying king vanished. In his eyes was a raw, ancient recognition. "You are the only thing that has felt real in 4 centuries, Alara born. If that means war, then let the mountains crumble." Before she could protest, Cashin surged forward, his hand snapping toward a silver whistle at his belt. "By the laws of the founding blood, I invoke the right of inspection. If she is truly the mate, let the bloodstone prove it. Otherwise, she is a spy to be executed on the spot." The guards stepped forward, their runic blades humming. Alara saw the flicker of doubt in Kalen's eyes, not doubt of her but of the stone. The bloodstone was a relic from the First Age, a sentient hunk of crimson crystal that only resonated with the purest of supernatural matches. A human had never even touched it. It was a trap and they both knew it. "Fine," Kalen growled, his voice a low thunder. "We go to the sanctum." The walk through the palace was a blur of opulence and terror. They descended into the bowels of the mountain, where the air grew thick with the scent of ozone and ancient earth. The sanctum was a circular chamber, dominated by a floating, jagged shard of red crystal that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, like a heart beating in the dark. The entire court had followed, a sea of pale faces and predatory eyes, all waiting for the moment the human girl would touch the stone and be incinerated by its rejection. "Place your hand on it, girl," Cashin sneered, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Let the truth set us all free." Kalen stepped beside her, his presence a shield. "Alara," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear. "Whatever happens, I will not let them take you. Do you trust me?" Alara looked at the pulsing stone, then up at the monster who had claimed her. She saw the loneliness in him, the same hunger for something more that had driven her to climb the palace walls. She realized then that they were both outsiders, he by his power, she by her mortality. "I trust the curiosity that brought me here," she whispered. She reached out. Her fingers trembled, the heat from the stone radiating against her palm. The moment her skin made contact, the chamber went silent. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Cashin began to laugh, a dry, rattling sound. "As I thought. A delusion." Guards seize. Then the stone didn't just pulse. It exploded with a blinding, golden light, a color never before seen in the vampire realm. The red crystal turned a brilliant, searing amber, and a shockwave of pure energy threw the guards back against the walls. Ilara felt a surge of warmth rush through her veins, a golden thread connecting her heart directly to the stone, and then to Kaelin. A vision seared into her mind, a prophecy written in a language of light. The blood of the weaver shall mend the shroud of the night. Kaelin gasped, his own hand flying to his chest as the bond snapped into place. It wasn't just a mating, it was a fusion. But as the light faded, the shock in the room turned into something far more dangerous. Cashin wasn't afraid, he was murderous. He realized that Ilara wasn't just an intruder, she was a threat to the entire social order of the vampire race. If a human could be the king's mate, the hierarchy was dead. The stone is corrupted. Cashin yelled, his voice cracking with rage. She is a witch. A human infiltrator using glamours to steal our crown. Kill her. Kill them both if you must. In the chaos, a hidden door in the sanctum wall hissed open. A woman stepped out, Isabella Thorne, a noblewoman who had been the favorite to be chosen tonight. Her eyes weren't red or silver, they were a hollow, oily black. She held a dagger carved from dragon bone, tipped with a poison that could kill even a king. He won't have a human, Isabella hissed, lunging not at Kaelin, but at Ilara's unprotected throat. Kaelin moved with supernatural speed, but he was too far. Ilara ducked, the blade whistling inches from her ear, but as she fell she saw the true horror. Behind Isabella, a dozen more nobles were drawing weapons. This wasn't just an execution anymore. It was a coup. To the catacombs. Kaelin roared, sweeping Ilara into his arms. He didn't fight his way out through the guards. He smashed his fist into the floor, the ancient stone cracking under his strength. They plummeted into the darkness below just as a volley of silver arrows hissed through the air where they had stood. As they hit the cold, damp floor of the tunnels, Ilara looked up at Kaelin. What now? Now, Kaelin said, his eyes glowing with a dark, resolved fire. We survive long enough to burn their world down and build a new one. The catacombs beneath the palace were a labyrinth of weeping stone and ancient dust, a place where the air tasted of centuries-old secrets and damp earth. Kaelin moved through the gloom with a predatory grace that even the pitch-black darkness couldn't hide. He didn't just walk, he drifted, his senses extended like invisible wires. In his arms, Ilara felt the rhythmic thud of his heart, slow, steady, and terrifyingly powerful. You can put me down, she whispered, her voice echoing softly against the moss-covered walls. I have my own legs, Kaelin. And I suspect we're going to need both of us moving if Cashin's men find the hatch. Kaelin paused, slowly lowering her to the ground. His hands lingered on her shoulders for a second too long, his silver eyes searching her face in the gloom. You are remarkably calm for a woman who was just declared the queen of a collapsing empire and nearly assassinated by a dragon-bone dagger. I've spent my life weaving shrouds for your people, King, Ilara said, straightening her tunic and trying to ignore the way her skin tingled where he touched her. When you spend every day working with the finery of the dead, you learn that the living are much more frightening. Besides, I've always been better at navigating tangles than avoiding them. Before we go any deeper into these dark tunnels, I want to ask you all a question. Ilara just showed some incredible bravery, didn't she? Have you ever had a moment where you had to find strength you didn't know you had? Tell me about your brave moment in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you're enjoying this journey into the shadows, make sure you've hit that subscribe button. We have so much more of this story to uncover together. Kaelin led her deeper into the maze, his hand firmly entwined with hers. The contact was a constant jolt of energy. Through the bond the bloodstone had forged, Ilara could feel the edges of his emotions. A roiling sea of protective fury and a surprising sharp spike of guilt. You're blaming yourself, she noted, her voice gentle. I brought you into the center of a storm, Kaelin growled, his grip tightening slightly. Cashin has wanted the throne for decades. He's been waiting for a moment of perceived weakness. By choosing you, by the stone choosing you, I gave him the perfect excuse to rally the traditionalists. They won't stop until they've purified the bloodline. Is that what I am to you? A moment of weakness. Ilara stopped, forcing him to turn and face her. The king's expression softened, the hard lines of his face yielding to something much more vulnerable. He stepped into her space, the scent of cedar and rain-washed stone enveloping her. No. You are the first moment of clarity I've had in 400 years. That's what terrifies them. A king who isn't fueled by blood debt but by something else. As they moved, the path grew narrower, the walls lined with the sarcophagi of long-dead vampire lords. Suddenly, Kalen pulled her into a shallow alcove, his hand clamping over her mouth. His body was a wall of cold marble against hers. Seconds later, the sound of boots echoed from the corridor they had just left. "Search every crypt," a voice commanded. Julian Vane, Cassion's most ruthless captain. "The girl is human, she'll leave a scent. If the king resists, remember, the council only needs his heart for the coronation of a successor. The rest is expendable." Alara's breath hitched. She could feel Kalen's muscles coil like a spring. He was ready to shift to tear through them, but there were too many. A fight here in the cramped tunnels would bring the ceiling down on both of them. Kalen leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Stay behind me. If I tell you to run, you head toward the sound of running water. There is an underground river that leads to the fringe colonies." "I'm not leaving you to be expendable," she hissed back, her fingers finding a loose, heavy stone in the wall. As the glow of the guards' runic lanterns began to spill around the corner, Kalen did something unexpected. He didn't lunge. He closed his eyes and whispered a word in that ancient, grinding language. The shadows in the alcove didn't just hide them. They rose up like a living curtain, weaving into a glamour that mimicked the stone wall itself. The guards marched past, the light of their lanterns passing mere inches from Alara's face. She could see the cruel set of Julian's jaw, the silver-tipped bolts in his crossbow. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain they would hear it, but Kalen's power held the illusion. When the footsteps finally faded, Kalen slumped slightly against the wall, the effort of the high-level glamour draining even his vast reserves. "You're exhausted," Alara realized, reaching out to steady him. "The bloodstone took more than just a confirmation," Kalen admitted, his voice rasping. "It initiated a synchronization. My power is currently tied to your physical state, Alara. As a human, your stamina is limited. Until the bond settles, I am only as strong as your heart allows me to be." This revelation changed everything. They weren't just partners, they were a closed circuit. He tired, he weakened. If she died, he fell. "Then we need to get out of these damp holes and find somewhere you can recover," Alara said with newfound determination. "I know these tunnels better than your guards do. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old veins, the tunnels the humans used to escape the First Great War. They intersect with these catacombs 2 miles east." As they began to move again, the tension shifted from the threat of the guards to the growing, undeniable heat between them. Every time Kalen helped her over a pile of rubble, every time their eyes met in the dark, the golden thread of the bond tightened. They reached a wide cavern where a waterfall of black water spilled into a deep basin. It was the only way forward, but the bridge had long since collapsed. "I'll have to carry you across," Kalen said, his eyes scanning the distance. "Kalen, you're shaking. The glamour took too much." "I can do it," he insisted, though his pale skin was now almost ashen. "No," Alara said, stepping toward the edge. She pointed to a series of iron rings embedded in the ceiling, remnants of the old human pulley systems. "We use those. I'll go first to test the tension. You follow." "Alara, it's too dangerous." "Trust the Weaver, King." She leaped, her fingers catching the first ring with a jarring snap. She swung with a grace born of years spent climbing the high rafters of the weaving looms. One ring, then another. Below, the black water churned with predatory fish that hadn't seen light in an eon. As she reached the other side, she looked back, her heart swelling with a strange mixture of pride and affection. Kalen was watching her, not as a master watching a servant, but as a man watching a miracle. But as Kalen gripped the first ring to follow, a silver bolt hissed out of the darkness of the tunnel they had just left, burying itself in his shoulder. "Kalen!" Alara screamed. He grunted, his grip slipping as the silver burned through his immortal flesh. He dangled over the abyss, his eyes locking onto hers. Behind him, Julian Vane stepped into the light, reloading his crossbow with a smirk. "The king is grounded," Julian shouted. "Now let's see how the human fares alone." The scream that tore from Alara's throat was drowned out by the roar of the black water below. Kalen hung by a single hand, the silver bolt in his shoulder emitting a sickening, hissing sound as it reacted with his ancient blood. His face was a mask of agony, his silver eyes flickering as the poison began to cloud his vision. Kaelin. Hold on. Alara's fingers dug into the jagged rocks of the ledge. She didn't think, she didn't calculate the odds. She lunged for the manual winch rusted into the cavern wall, a relic of the human laborers who had built this place. It was seized by centuries of grime, but she threw her entire weight against the iron lever. On the far ledge, Julian Vane laughed, a cold, clinical sound. You're wasting your breath, human. Silver of that purity doesn't just wound, it paralyzes. He's already dead. Wait. Move away from the winch and I might make your end quick. You don't know a thing about weight, Alara spat, her muscles screaming as the gears finally groaned. With a shriek of protesting metal, the iron cable attached to the rings began to move. The vibration of the moving cable gave Kaelin the fraction of momentum he needed. With a guttural roar of defiance, he swung his body, his boots catching the edge of the ledge just as his fingers gave way. Alara grabbed the collar of his heavy cloak, hauling him onto the solid stone with a strength that felt entirely unnatural. They tumbled backward into the dark just as a second bolt whistled through the space where his head had been. Alara didn't stop. She dragged him into a narrow crevice behind the waterfall, the curtain of freezing, dark water masking their heat signatures and their scent. Kaelin slumped against the wall, his breathing ragged. The silver bolt was glowing with a faint, malevolent blue light. Alara, you have to leave it, he gasped, his hand clutching her wrist. The poison it's a locking agent. It's designed to drain the core. My magic it's bleeding out. I'm not leaving you, she said, her voice hard as flint. She reached for the bolt. Don't. Kaelin warned. The silver will sear human flesh. It will take your hand. Then let it. She gripped the fletching of the bolt. Before we witness what happens next, I have to ask. Have you ever been so committed to someone that you'd risk everything without a second thought? That kind of loyalty is rare, and it's what we celebrate here. If you believe Alara is doing the right thing, leave a red heart in the comments. Your engagement helps us bring more of these high-stakes stories to life. And if you're new, don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss the revelation that's about to change everything. Alara yanked. The silver didn't burn her. To Kaelin's shock and Alara's confusion, the moment her fingers touched the metal, the blue glow died. The silver didn't sear her skin. Instead, a warmth spread from her palm into the bolt, turning the metal brittle and dull. It slid out of Kaelin's shoulder like it was made of lead, clattering harmlessly to the floor. Kaelin stared at her, his wound already beginning to knit back together now that the inhibitor was gone. That's impossible. Human blood cannot neutralize consecrated silver. Only a descendant of the first architects. He stopped, his eyes widening as he looked at the golden glow still fading from Alara's fingertips. Kaelin, what is happening to me? She whispered, staring at her hands. He reached out, taking her hand in his. He didn't look at her as a king looks at a subject, but as a man looking at a miracle he finally understands. The Weavers' Guild of Oakhaven. Your family has lived there for generations, haven't they? Since the Great War, she nodded. We were the ones who stayed behind to clothe the survivors. You weren't weaving clothes, Alara, Kaelin said, his voice hushed with awe. The prophecy of the blood of the weaver wasn't about fabric. The first architects were the humans who held the balance of magic before the vampires took the throne. They were called weavers because they could manipulate the very threads of energy, the same energy that powers the bloodstone. The same energy that makes you the only being on this earth capable of standing beside me. The revelation hit Alara like a physical blow. Her life in the fringe, the fever that took her mother, the maps her father hid, it wasn't just a struggle for survival. It was a concealment. Her mother hadn't died of a predator's whim. She had been hunted because of what she carried in her veins. The vampires didn't just conquer the world, Alara realized, her voice trembling. You suppressed the only people who could check your power. My people. Yes, Kaelin admitted, the shame in his voice raw. But the bloodstone isn't a vampire relic. It's an architect's tool. It didn't choose you because you were a fit for me. It chose you because you are the key to the stone itself. You aren't my mate by some supernatural accident, Alara. You are the correction to a 400-year-old mistake. As he spoke, the golden thread between them flared. Alara felt a rush of memories, not hers but Kaelin's. She saw the centuries of his loneliness, the way he had tried to protect the human colonies from the shadows, and the secret grief he carried for a world he felt he had helped destroy. But the moment of vulnerability was shattered. From the shadows of the cave, a figure stepped out. It wasn't Julian Vane. It was Lord Cashin himself, holding a crystalline orb that pulsed with a dark, suffocating light. "So the king has finally figured it out," Cashin sneered, his eyes fixed on Alara with a terrifying hunger. "I knew the architect blood hadn't been fully purged. I've been searching for the Golden Weaver for decades. Why do you think I allowed your little colony to thrive, girl? I was waiting for the spark to manifest." He raised the orb. "The king thinks you are his salvation. But to the council you are the ultimate battery. With your blood and Kaelin's heart, we won't just rule the night, we will extinguish the sun." Before Kaelin could lunge, Cashin smashed the orb on the ground. A wave of obsidian-colored mist erupted, curling around Alara's ankles like living chains. "Alara, run!" Kaelin roared, but as he moved to grab her, the mist solidified into jagged spikes, impaling his shadow and pinning him to the cavern wall. "You've spent too much time in the sun, Kaelin," Cashin mocked, stepping toward the paralyzed Alara. "You've forgotten that in the dark I am the one who weaves the ending." As Cashin's cold hand gripped her throat, Alara realized the darkest truth of all. Her presence hadn't just saved Kaelin, it had given his enemies the one weapon they needed to destroy everything. The transition from the damp, freezing catacombs to the sterile, terrifying opulence of the High Council's interrogation chamber was a blur of violence and shadows. Alara sat bound in a chair of cold iron, the metal designed to suppress any flicker of the architect's power she had only just begun to understand. Across from her, suspended by runic shackles that bled his essence into the floor, was Kaelin. He looked broken. The silver-rimmed eyes that had once held the authority of a god were now dimmed, his head hanging low as the siphon spikes in the walls drew his ancient blood drop by drop. Every time he tried to lift his gaze to Alara, a surge of violet electricity crackled through the chains, forcing a guttural groan of agony from his throat. "Stop it!" Alara screamed, her voice hoarse from hours of futile struggling. "Cashin, he's your king. This is treason." Lord Cashin stood by a panoramic window that looked out over the sprawling, moonlit citadel. He didn't turn around. "King?" Kaelin was a placeholder. A sentry waiting for a dawn that was never supposed to come. "You, however." He turned, his eyes reflecting the dark, oily light of the siphon orbs. "You are the fuel for a new era." He walked toward her, the heels of his boots clicking with agonizing precision on the marble. "Do you know what happens to a weaver when their blood is forced through a vampire's heart core? It doesn't just grant power. It grants permanence. No more sleeping in the dirt. No more fearing the sun. We will become the eternal architects of this world." "You'll be monsters," Alara spat, leaning forward as far as the iron would allow. "Even more than you are now." Cashin smiled, a thin, bloodless line. "Perhaps. But we will be living monsters." He leaned in closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "And the best part, Alara? To start the reaction, the king must be the one to take your life. The bond the bloodstone forged? It's a bridge. I'm simply going to drive a tank across it." The horror of his plan settled into Alara's bones like ice. They weren't just going to kill her. They were going to force Kaelin to be the instrument of her destruction, using their connection to bypass the natural laws of magic. "Before we see if there's any hope left in this nightmare, I have to check in with you. This is the moment where everything feels lost. Have you ever felt like you were backed into a corner with no way out? It's in these darkest hours that true character is revealed." If you're rooting for Kaelin and Alara to find a miracle, comment strength below. And please, if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We are approaching the climax of this journey and you need to see how this ends. The chamber doors swung open and Isabella Thorne walked in, her face twisted in a mask of jealous triumph. She held a ceremonial blade, the Heart Stitcher. "The council is ready, Cashin," Isabella said, her gaze darting to Kaelin with a cruel shimmer. "The lunar alignment is perfect. Let's begin the extraction." Kaelin's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a spark of his old fire. "I will burn this entire mountain to ash before I touch her, Cashin. I will starve my own heart." "Oh, Kaelin," Cashin sighed, stepping toward the control pedestal. "You still think choice is a luxury you possess. The siphon spikes don't just take your blood, they take your will." He slammed his hand onto the pedestal. The runes on Kaelin's chains turned a blinding, aggressive red. Kaelin screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated torment that shattered the glass vials on the nearby tables. His body went rigid, his muscles bulging as the magical compulsion took hold. Against his will, Kaelin's hand began to reach out. His fingers, though trembling with the effort to resist, were being puppeted by the dark magic. Run. He wheezed, his eyes weeping crimson tears as he fought his own limbs. I can't move, Kaelin. Elara cried, her heart breaking more at the look of betrayal on his face than at the threat to her own life. It's okay. I know it's not you. Look at me, Kaelin, look at me. But he couldn't. The magic was too strong. Slowly, the shackles dragged him toward her chair. Isabella handed the heart stitcher to his moving hand. His fingers closed around the hilt. Kill the girl, save the race, Cashin commanded, his voice booming with a dark authority. Kaelin stood over her now, the blade trembling inches from her chest. Elara could see the sweat pouring down his face, the way his knuckles were white as he fought to turn the blade away. The golden thread of the bond was screaming, vibrating with a high-pitched frequency that made Elara's ears bleed. I love you, she whispered, the words coming out as a soft, final breath. The blade began to descend. Kaelin's eyes were wide, filled with a soul-crushing despair. He was a king, a warrior, an immortal, and he was being forced to murder the only light he had ever found in the dark. The tip of the blade touched the fabric of her tunic, right over her heart. The world seemed to slow to a crawl. The air grew heavy. In that moment of absolute hopelessness, Elara didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, sharp clarity. If she was a weaver, if she could manipulate the threads of energy, then the bond wasn't just a bridge for Cashin to use. It was a weapon for her to wield. But as she reached for that inner spark, the violet electricity surged one last time, and Kaelin's arm lunged forward with a force that no human and no vampire could stop. The tip of the heart stitcher pierced the first layer of Elara's tunic, the cold steel a needle prick of reality against her skin. Kaelin's face was a mask of agony, a silent scream etched into his features as his own muscles betrayed him. But in that microsecond of contact, the physical pain triggered something ancient and dormant within Elara's marrow. She didn't fight the iron chair. She didn't fight the guards. Instead, she followed the golden thread of the bond inward, back toward the source. She remembered the way the bloodstone had felt, not like a weight but like a symphony. If Kaelin's magic was being siphoned into the room to control him, then the room itself was now a loom. And she was the weaver. Kaelin, she gasped, not a plea but a command. Give me the thread. A blinding flash of amber light erupted from the point where the blade touched her chest. It wasn't a wound, it was a connection. The cold iron bonds around her wrists didn't just break. They turned to liquid, weeping off her skin like mercury. The golden energy surged through the heart stitcher, traveling up Kaelin's arm and shattering the violet compulsion magic like brittle glass. Kaelin fell to his knees, the ceremonial blade clattering to the floor. The runic shackles holding him snapped outward, the metal curling back as if afraid of the heat Elara was radiating. For the first time in hours, Kaelin breathed, a deep, shuddering lungful of air that wasn't tainted by the siphon. What did you do? Cashin roared, stumbling back from the control pedestal as sparks showered him. Elara stood up, her hair floating in an invisible current of power. Her eyes weren't human anymore. They were twin pools of molten gold, reflecting a lineage that predated the first vampire king. I stopped weaving shrouds, Cashin, she said, her voice echoing with a strange harmonic resonance. I've started weaving a cage. Before we see Elara unleash the full scale of her power, I have to know. Who else got goosebumps? The moment the underdog finds their bite is what we live for. If you're cheering for Elara right now, smash that like button and tell me weave in the comments. And seriously, if you aren't subscribed yet, you're about to miss the most epic showdown in our channel's history. Don't blink. Kaelin rose beside her. He was still weakened, his skin ashen and his clothes torn, but as he reached out and took Elara's hand, the synchronization was complete. The golden light of the weaver and the silver shadow of the vampire merged, creating a shimmering, iridescent aura that pushed back the darkness of the chamber. The bond, Kaelin whispered, his voice returning to its full melodic strength. It's not a battery, Cashin. It's an anchor. You tried to use a human to power a god, But you forgot that humans are the ones who built the gods in the first place. Cashin's face went pale. He lunged for a secondary lever, desperate to trigger the mountain's self-destruct or call the full weight of the royal guard. But Alara simply flicked her wrist. The violet energy still lingering in the siphon orbs obeyed her gesture, twisting into translucent threads that lashed out and bound Cashin's hands to his sides. Julian. Isabella. Kill them. Cashin screamed, his voice cracking with terror. Isabella Thorne lunged with a snarl, her fangs fully extended, but Kaelin moved with a speed that was no longer just supernatural. It was blurred by Alara's temporal weave. He didn't strike her. He simply caught her wrist and redirected her momentum, sending her crashing into the siphon orbs. The impact caused a feedback loop of magic that knocked her unconscious instantly. Julian Vane and the guards charged, but they found themselves walking through air that had turned thick as honey. Alara was manipulating the very density of the room, pulling the threads of reality tight. Kaelin, Alara said, her voice steady. The High Council is gathering in the hall below. They think they're coming for a coronation. Kaelin looked at her, and for the first time he smiled. A genuine, dangerous, and incredibly beautiful expression. Then let's give them a revolution instead. He swept her into his arms, but this time it wasn't to protect her. It was a partnership of equals. With a single powerful kick, Kaelin shattered the panoramic window. The two of them leaped into the night, but they didn't fall. Alara wove a path of solid light beneath their feet, a golden staircase descending from the peak of the citadel toward the stunned masses below. The turning point was over. The hunted had become the hunters, and the dawn they were bringing was going to be brighter than anything the vampire race had ever seen. The descent from the heights of the citadel was a vision of celestial fire. As Kaelin and Alara landed at the base of the golden staircase, the massive doors of the great hall burst open. The High Council, 12 of the oldest, most cynical vampires in existence, stood frozen. They had expected Cashin to descend with a cup of stolen power. Instead, they found their king standing hand in hand with the human weaver, both wreathed in a terrifying, beautiful light. Treason, cried Lord Sterling, the eldest of the council. The king has been corrupted by the human sorcery. Guards, erase this stain from our history. The royal guard, hundreds of elite warriors with silver-edged halberds, hesitated. They looked at Kaelin, their sovereign whose very presence usually demanded a bow, and then at Alara, whose golden aura felt like the rising sun they hadn't seen in centuries. The only stain here is the greed of the council. Kaelin's voice boomed, echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a physical strike. He stepped forward, and with every stride, the ground beneath his feet cracked, leaking golden light from the ley lines Alara was awakening below the floorboards. You sought to turn a sacred bond into a slaughterhouse. You sought to weaponize the one thing that could save our dying race. Before the final strike falls, I have to know, who's ready for justice? The council has pulled the strings for too long, and it's time for the puppets to cut themselves free. If you're standing with Kaelin and Alara, drop a crossed swords in the comments. And make sure you're subscribed. We are seconds away from the twist that changes everything for the vampire world. Julian Vane, having recovered from the tower, charged from the flank. He was a blur of steel and malice, his blade aimed directly for Alara's heart. He was fast, but Kaelin was absolute. Kaelin didn't even draw a weapon. He simply raised his hand, and the golden threads Alara had woven into his very armor flared. The impact sent Julian flying back through a stained glass window, his shadow magic dissolving in the light. "Now, Alara!" Kaelin shouted. Alara closed her eyes and reached deep into the foundations of the mountain. She wasn't just weaving light anymore. She was weaving the truth. She pulled on the threads of the great lie. The magic the council used to keep the human colonies in fear and the vampires in a state of perpetual hunger. "I see the knots," Alara cried, her voice rising to a melodic crescendo. "And I undo them." She slammed her palms onto the onyx floor. A massive wave of amber energy rippled outward, passing through every guard, every noble, and every council member. It didn't kill them. It did something far more devastating. It stripped away their glamours. The council members, who had looked like youthful gods moments before, suddenly appeared as they truly were, shriveled, gray, and hollowed out by their own corruption. The pure blood they boasted of was revealed to be a parasitic rot. The high hall, once a place of intimidating shadow, was flooded with a warmth that felt like a midsummer afternoon. The choice wasn't about a bride, Elara proclaimed, standing tall as the energy swirled around her like a cyclone. The choice was about a path. You chose the dark, but the light is here to claim the debt. Lord Sterling lunged for the bloodstone, which had been moved to the center of the hall for the expected ritual. He tried to shatter it to kill the source of the power. But the moment his hand touched the stone, the amber light turned into a searing white fire. The stone didn't break, it bloomed. The jagged red crystal transformed into a clear, radiant diamond. The shockwave of the transformation sent the High Council sprawling, their power neutralized by the sheer purity of the resonance. In the center of the hall, Kaelin and Elara stood alone in a circle of white light. The guards dropped their weapons one by one, falling to their knees, not in fear but in a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace. The thirst that had driven their race to cruelty for eons simply vanished. The Weaver had mended the hunger. Kaelin looked at the council, his eyes no longer crimson or cold silver, but a warm, living gray. "The reign of the shadows is over," he declared. "The citadel is no longer a tomb. It is a home." But as the victory settled, Elara felt the weight of the magic she had channeled. The golden light began to fade and she collapsed. Kaelin caught her before she hit the floor, his arms the strongest thing she had ever known. "Elara," he whispered, his voice trembling with a fear he hadn't felt even in the face of death. She looked up at him and smiled, her skin pale but her spirit bright. "We did it, Kaelin. The threads, they're finally straight." The transition was not instantaneous, but as the weeks bled into months, the world outside the citadel began to reflect the change that had started in the High Hall. The heavy, oppressive mists that had choked the fringe colonies for centuries began to lift, revealing a sky so blue it made the elders of Oakhaven weep. The tithe was abolished, replaced by a new covenant of trade and mutual restoration. Inside the palace, the cold onyx floors were now covered in the vibrant, intricate tapestries of the Weavers' Guild. Sunlight streamed through the windows, no longer a weapon of execution but a source of warmth. The vampires, or the Ethel, as they were now beginning to call themselves, found that while they still carried the grace of the night, the jagged, burning hunger that had once turned them into monsters had been replaced by a sustainable internal hum of magic provided by the restored bloodstone. Kaelin Kovacs stood on the balcony of the royal suite, his charcoal-colored cloak fluttering in a gentle breeze. He looked out over a city that was finally breathing. Beside him, Elara Bourne leaned against the stone railing, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with a thread of golden light that danced between her knuckles. "You're thinking about the looms again," Kaelin said, his voice a low, warm vibration that still sent a thrill through her. "I'm thinking about the patterns," Elara corrected, turning to look at him. "How we all thought we were separate threads, destined to tangle and snap, when really we were part of a design that just needed a little mending." Kaelin reached out, taking her hand. The bond between them was no longer a frantic, surging wire. It was a deep, rhythmic pulse as natural as the tide. "My father used to say that a king's duty was to hold the dark at bay. He never realized the goal was to welcome the morning. I want to take a moment to thank every single one of you for coming on this 40-minute journey with us. Seeing Elara go from a girl in the shadows to a queen of light has been nothing short of incredible. What was your favorite part of the story? Was it the reveal in the catacombs or the moment the council fell? Let me know in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs a reminder that even the darkest nights end in dawn. Elara's father, Silas, had moved to the Citadel, where he now oversaw the grandest weaving project the world had ever seen, a shroud of peace that would be displayed in the town square. He no longer looked at the horizon with fear. He looked at it with the pride of a man whose daughter had rewritten history. As for Lord Cashin and the council, they were not executed. Kaelin, under Elara's influence, chose a different path. They were exiled to the far reaches of the frozen wastes, stripped of their stolen power and forced to live as mortals. To an immortal who valued nothing but status, it was a fate far more educational than death. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of violet, orange and gold. Kaelin pulled Elara closer, resting his forehead against hers. "The elders want to know when the official coronation will be," he murmured. "They're demanding a date." Elara laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed over the ramparts. Tell them the ceremony started the moment you found me in the gallery, Kaelin. Everything since then has just been the celebration. I can live with that, he whispered. He leaned down, and as the first stars of the new era began to twinkle above the citadel, the Vampire King and the Weaver's daughter shared a kiss that tasted of cedar, rain, and a future that was no longer a mystery but a promise. The shadows were gone, the threads were mended, and for the first time in 400 years, the heart of the world was beating in perfect time. The story of the girl who hid to witness a ritual ended not with a death, but with a beginning. A love that had survived the dark to redefine the light.